Some places disappear with fire and sirens. Others disappear so quietly that, years later, you are not sure you are remembering a real place or inventing one. On the north shore of Long Island, there is a stone gatehouse that still stands like a pause in the road. It looks ordinary until you learn what it once guarded, because behind that threshold, on a bluff above Long Island Sound, a white castle used to rise. A real castle. Smooth white walls, sharp towers, built in 1917 and 1918 to look as if it had survived centuries. Then, in 1945, it was demolished. Not by war or storm, but by a decision. Machine by machine, wall by wall. The kind of erasure that feels deliberate, as if someone wanted the coastline to forget what it had been. Its name was Beacon Towers, and the mystery is not only that it vanished, it is what the castle was and who it belonged to. Beacon Towers began as the creation of Alva Vanderbilt Belmont, a woman of enormous wealth who poured her influence into the fight for women's suffrage. Later it passed to William Randolph Hearst, the newspaper tycoon who understood spectacle better than anyone in America. All the while, the Jazz Age shimmered nearby, and Fitzgerald watched these shores and wrote The Great Gatsby, a novel haunted by lights across the water and dreams that cannot be kept. Tonight, we will follow Beacon Towers through each of those worlds. The Gold Coast, where houses were built to speak, the suffrage era that reshaped democracy, the media empire that turned private life into public myth, and the economic storms that turned beauty into a bill. And when we return to that gatehouse at the end, the question will not be what the castle looked like. The question will be why it was allowed to disappear. Chapter 1. The Gold Coast and the White Castle. The Gold Coast and the tip of Sands Point. Long Island is shaped like a long arm reaching east. On its northern side, the land faces the Long Island Sound. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, that northern shoreline became one of the most concentrated displays of American wealth in the country. Newspapers called it the Gold Coast. The phrase was not only about money, it was about how money looked. It was about estates that copied European palaces, about private roads and gates, about yachts and stables and staff quarters. It was about a class of Americans who had fortunes larger than the budgets of some nations, and who were still trying to prove they belonged among the old elites of Europe. Sands Point sat right in the middle of this world. It was close enough to New York City to feel connected, but far enough away to feel like a private kingdom. The peninsula narrowed as it reached north, and at the very tip the land met water on multiple sides. From there you could look across the Sound toward Connecticut. You could watch ships move like slow toys. You could see weather arrive long before it reached you. In 1917, Alva Vanderbilt Belmont purchased about 7 acres of beachfront property at this tip of Sands Point, reportedly for $84,000. The choice was strategic. A shoreline estate offered privacy because it had fewer directions of approach. It also offered drama because the sea framed everything in wide, cinematic space. There was another detail nearby that mattered. A lighthouse stood close to the property. It was part of a system of navigation lights that protected vessels along the coast. A lighthouse is a beacon. A lighthouse exists to be seen. It warns, guides, and declares that land is near. In time, that idea of a beacon would become part of the estate's identity, and the castle would take a name that echoed signal fires and watchtowers. Beacon Towers. But do not imagine this place as quiet. The Gold Coast was full of motion. Trains brought people from Manhattan. Carriages and automobiles carried guests to parties. Staff arrived and left. Deliveries came daily. Gardens demanded constant work. Large homes were like small towns that required supplies, labor, and management. In that world, a house was not just shelter. A house was a statement, and Alva Belmont was never interested in making small statements. The name Alva Vanderbilt Belmont appears early in this story because she commissioned Beacon Towers and paid for it. But to understand why she wanted a castle on the sea and what she did with it, we need to step back into her life and her politics. That story begins in the next chapter. A castle like this did not run on stone alone. Behind every bright room and every silent corridor was a hidden system of labor, and that system could be as costly as the walls themselves. It is easy to look at photographs of Beacon Towers and think only about the owner. But a mansion is a machine, and machines require operators. Great houses on the Gold Coast were staffed by cooks, maids, laundresses, gardeners, drivers, stable hands, and managers. Some lived on the grounds, some commuted, Their work remained mostly invisible to guests by design. Service was supposed to feel effortless. Beacon towers required the same. Food arrived and had to be prepared. Rooms had to be cleaned daily. Fireplaces had to be tended. Linens had to be washed. Windows had to be polished. Floors had to be maintained. Gardens had to be trimmed. Repairs had to be made before a visitor could notice a flaw. This labor system was part of the contradiction of the era. A woman could fight for democratic rights while living within a household structure built on hierarchy. That contradiction does not erase the political achievement, but it does remind us that history is never simple. It also helps explain why great estates were vulnerable. When tastes changed or money tightened, the first challenge was not the beauty of the building. The challenge was the cost of keeping the machine running. Many later accounts state that the annual expense of staff and maintenance at Beacon Towers was enormous. Exact figures vary across sources, and the most reliable point is not the number but the reality. Operating a castle on the shoreline required a constant stream of money. Alva could afford it for a time, but even in her world, a building like this asked the same question every day. How long will the owner be willing to pay for the dream? Chapter 2. Alva Belmont and the Fortress for the Vote. If Alva Belmont seems difficult to pin down as a hero or a villain, that is because her life contains both kinds of evidence. One of the most famous episodes involves her daughter Consuelo. In the world Alva inhabited, marriage was not only romance. Marriage was strategy. A wedding could merge fortunes, elevate status, and secure power for generations. In 1895, Consuelo Vanderbilt married Charles Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough, at St. Thomas Church in Manhattan. The marriage became one of the most talked-about society events of its era. It also became a symbol of what American wealth could buy in Europe. An ancient title, a historic palace, and the appearance of aristocratic legitimacy. Accounts and biographies describe the match as heavily coerced. Consuelo was reportedly in love with someone else. Alva insisted on the Duke. The story, repeated by historians and later writers, is that Alva used intense pressure to force the marriage. The result was a public spectacle and, for Consuelo, a deeply unhappy arrangement. Why include this in the story of Beacon Towers? Because it shows Alva's central trait, a belief that she could impose her will on the world through wealth, planning, and spectacle. She was capable of using power in ways that harmed people close to her. She was also capable of redirecting that power toward public change. Her later suffrage activism can be seen as a transformation of the same energy. Instead of forcing a daughter into a marriage, she forced politicians to confront women demanding the vote. Instead of building a palace to impress society, she built a castle to broadcast a cause. The tools were similar, the target changed. This makes Beacon Towers easier to understand. The castle was not built by a gentle personality. It was built by someone who believed that history could be pushed, even if it resisted, buying the shoreline and choosing the architects. In 1917, Alva turned her attention north, to Sands Point. She purchased the 7-acre beachfront parcel at the tip of the peninsula. This was not only a purchase of land, it was a purchase of visibility. Anything built there would be seen from the water, from the air, and from neighboring estates. For the design, Alva selected Hunt and Hunt, the architectural firm led by Richard Howland Hunt and Joseph Howland Hunt. Their father, Richard Morris Hunt, had shaped the look of American elite architecture in the 19th century, bringing European training and prestige into the United States. Working with the Hunt family was a statement in itself. It signaled that this would be a major project, not a minor country house. The time period matters. The First World War was still underway. In Europe, real castles had been damaged or destroyed. In America, the war economy was reshaping industry and public mood. Yet on Long Island, the wealth of the very rich still translated into construction. Beacon Towers was built from 1917 to 1918. That short timeline suggests intense focus and funding. The castle rose fast, as if someone willed it into existence. The style chosen was Gothic Revival. But this was not academic Gothic, carefully matching a single medieval source. It was theatrical, Gothic, borrowing shapes that read as castle to the modern eye. Towers, battlements, dramatic silhouettes. Accounts describe it as a fantasy that blended French and Spanish influences, coated in smooth white stucco so that it looked bright against the sea. It is worth pausing on that color. Most stone castles are gray or brown. White stucco made Beacon Towers look almost unreal in sunlight and luminous in moonlight. It also linked the building to the idea of purity and heroism that Alva associated with Joan of Arc. Even the name of the estate carried layered meaning. Beacon towers reference the nearby lighthouse and the broader idea of signal towers. A beacon is not passive. It declares presence. It attracts attention. It warns and guides. That was exactly what Alva wanted. Inside a Gothic fantasy. From the outside, beacon towers looked like a medieval fortress dropped onto an American coastline. Turrets and crenellations cut into the sky. Walls rose above terraces and gardens. Balconies faced the water. The overall effect was not comfort, but command. The interior, however, was designed for life as the elite lived it, with rooms dedicated to specific forms of social action. Great houses of this era were organized like systems. There were formal spaces for receptions, dining, and display. There were private spaces for the owners. There were working spaces for staff, storage, and service. A mansion functioned because dozens of people made it function. Accounts of beacon towers describe a complex house, often estimated at around about 60 main rooms, and well over 100 rooms in total. Depending on how you count service spaces and corridors, spread across multiple levels. Exact counts vary across sources, but the scale was never in doubt. It was a massive home, not a romantic cottage. The Library of Congress holds architectural drawings for beacon towers, created by Hunt and Hunt in 1917, including a first floor plan. Those surviving plans confirm the serious architectural planning behind the fantasy facade. This was not a simple stage set. It was a real residence designed with the precision of professional architecture. On the grounds, privacy was reinforced through walls and controlled entrances. The coastline provided natural separation, but wealth often wanted extra barriers. In the Gold Coast world, privacy was not only a desire, it was an assertion of class. And then there were the symbolic choices. Beacon Towers was not built merely to impress visitors. It was built to express Alva's identity at this stage of her life. Wealthy, independent, militant in her politics, and obsessed with a particular heroine, Joan of Arc. To understand why Alva built Beacon Towers the way she did, you have to see the pattern in her life. Again and again, she learned that society listened when wealth was staged as architecture and ceremony. Before Beacon Towers, Alva had already proven that she could turn luxury into propaganda. At Marble House in Newport, Rhode Island, she hosted major women's suffrage conferences in 1909 and again in 1914. These were not private gatherings hidden from society. They were public events designed to attract attention. Visitors could enter the grounds and attend programs that connected political arguments to an environment usually reserved for elite leisure. The choice of location was strategic. Marble House was famous as a symbol of Vanderbilt wealth. Newspapers covered it. Tourists and social observers talked about it. When Alva filled that space with votes for women messaging, she forced the public to connect suffrage with the most visible kind of American privilege. The conferences included speeches, fundraising, and organized spectacle. Alva treated them like society events, because society events were what she knew how to run. But the purpose was not gossip. The purpose was momentum. This approach also changed the movement's relationship to the press. Reporters who might ignore a small meeting could not ignore an event at a Vanderbilt mansion. Photographs and descriptions traveled far beyond Newport. Money raised at these events could be donated back into the movement. This is the pattern that leads to Beacon Towers. Alva did not separate her private life from her politics. She fused them. Her houses were not only places to live, they were tools. Beacon Towers, built later and even more dramatic, followed the same logic. A castle on the shoreline would not only shelter Alva, it would broadcast her identity to the world. Joan of Arc on the walls. Joan of Arc was a teenage girl from France who claimed divine guidance, led armies, and challenged political and religious authority. She was captured, tried, and executed. Later, she became a symbol used by many groups: nationalists, Catholics, feminists, and people who admired courage against overwhelming power. Alva Belmont admired Joan of Arc intensely. In Joan, she saw a figure who defied expectation, refused to submit, and paid a price for conviction. For a woman fighting for political rights in a society that expected obedience, Joan was not just inspirational, she was a mirror. Beacon Towers carried that obsession into its decoration. Murals depicting scenes from Joan's life were created for the castle by the artist Vincent Adarente. Museum collections and documentation preserve sketches connected to these murals, confirming the project and the theme. The imagery made the castle feel like a shrine as well as a home. This matters because it tells us what Alva wanted beacon towers to be. She did not choose neutral decoration. She did not fill the walls with safe landscapes and pleasant patterns. She filled them with struggle. In a sense, Beacon Towers was a political building disguised as a private estate. The castle's medieval language was not only about romance, it was about resistance. A fortress is built for defense, but also for signaling strength. When visitors came to Beacon Towers, they did not just see wealth. They saw a worldview. They saw a woman aligning herself with a saint and a soldier, a young woman who faced judges and flames rather than surrender. This was not the typical message of the Gold Coast, where so many estates existed to celebrate family names and leisure. Beacon Towers celebrated a cause, and during the years after its construction, the castle became part of the infrastructure of that cause. That instinct for spectacle soon turned into an instinct for strategy. When she chose Joan of Arc as a symbol, she was not decorating a home. She was building a message that visitors could not ignore. When wealth meets a movement, at the start of the 20th century, the fight for women's voting rights in the United States had already lasted for decades. Activists organized meetings, published essays, held parades, and petitioned legislators. Some states granted women voting rights, often in the West, but national victory remained uncertain. The movement also carried divisions. Many mainstream suffrage organizations focused on educated middle-class white women and often excluded or neglected working-class women, immigrants, and black women. Strategies differed as well. Some activists believed in cautious lobbying, others believed in direct confrontation. Alva Belmont entered this world as a wealthy social figure, which made her both useful and controversial. Some suffragists welcomed her money, others feared her domineering personality, but few could ignore her. In 1909, Alva founded the Political Equality League, an organization aimed at building suffrage support in New York. She also supported national efforts. Historical accounts report that she helped fund the relocation of the National American Women's Suffrage Association offices to New York, paying moving fees and rent for office space. She financed a press bureau and hired writers to expand suffrage coverage in newspapers. She also attempted, in ways that were serious but also shaped by the prejudices of her era, to broaden the movement. Records note that she encouraged black club women in New York to form a black branch of her organization and helped establish a suffrage settlement house in Harlem. She established a network of suffrage settlement houses across the New York City area. These settlements served as places where women could meet, learn about politics, and organize locally. They were designed to bring political education into neighborhoods rather than keeping it inside elite clubs. Alva's support was not only financial, she used her properties as platforms. In Newport, her home marble house became the site of suffrage conferences and gatherings. Those events placed political action inside the most glamorous spaces of American wealth. It was a deliberate reversal. Spaces designed to impress society became spaces designed to pressure government. Alva admired the militant methods of British suffragettes. She watched how activists like Emmeline Pankhurst used public protest, and she concluded that polite requests were not enough. In America, the movement was changing. A new wing was pushing for federal action and public confrontation. Alva would soon help fund that shift, and when she decided to build her final great American home, she would build it not as a retreat, but as a symbol. When Alva joined the movement, she joined a story already full of endurance. The Women's Rights Convention at Seneca Falls in 1848 had declared that women should have the right to vote. That was nearly 70 years before the first White House pickets. Generations of activists had written petitions, built organizations, and endured ridicule. By the early 20th century, the movement had become more visible. Parades filled streets, speakers toured the country, newspapers debated the issue. Some states granted women voting rights. But the federal government did not move quickly. Part of the difficulty was structural. The United States Constitution could only be amended through a process that required broad support. Congress had to approve a proposed amendment, then 3/4 of the states had to ratify it. Every step created opportunities for delay. Another difficulty was cultural. Many people believed that women's participation in politics would disrupt family life, religion, and social order. Arguments against suffrage often portrayed women as too emotional for politics or claimed that voting would corrupt them. Suffragists answered with evidence and moral argument. They pointed to women already doing public work, teaching, reform, charity, settlement houses, and labor organizing. They argued that if women were expected to obey laws, they should have a voice in making them. In this landscape, Alva's money mattered. Money paid for printing, money paid for travel, money paid for offices, rent, and staff. Money also bought attention, because newspapers reported on wealthy social figures. Alva used that attention to turn a political issue into a public conversation. That still did not guarantee success. What pushed the movement into its final phase was a combination of persistence and confrontation. That is why the story of picketing and imprisonment is not a side detail. It is part of the mechanism that moved a stalled system. And it is why a castle built during that fight feels like more than decoration. It feels like a monument built at the moment when pressure was becoming inevitable. The White House pickets did not win the vote by themselves, but they changed the political climate. They did something essential in a democracy. They made inaction look shameful. President Woodrow Wilson had not begun his presidency as a strong supporter of a federal suffrage amendment. He moved slowly. Activists pressured him in public and in private. They used arguments based on justice, based on democracy, and eventually based on the moral stakes of World War I. On the 30th of September, 1918, Wilson went to the Senate chamber and delivered an address supporting the women's suffrage amendment. He framed it as a measure essential to what he called the Great War of Humanity. His speech did not instantly change every senator's mind, but it was a major shift. The President of the United States was now openly urging the Senate to act. This mattered because the amendment had repeatedly faced Senate resistance. Wilson's intervention added weight. Combined with continued activism, it helped move the process forward. Congress eventually approved the amendment, and the ratification fight moved to the states. The final state needed for ratification was Tennessee, which approved it on the 18th of August 1920. The 19th Amendment became law. When people retell the suffrage story, they often focus on one date or one heroic leader. The truth is that victory required a chain of events and many hands. It required organizers, writers, speakers, marchers, donors, and prisoners. Alva Belmont was not the only reason the amendment passed, but she was an essential part of the chain. Her money strengthened organizations, her leadership amplified militant tactics, her public presence drew attention, and her buildings, including Beacon Towers, served as monuments that kept the cause visible. That is why Beacon Towers belongs in political history, not only in architectural history. After the vote, what comes next? The ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920 did not end the fight for women's equality. It ended one chapter and opened many others. The National Woman's Party shifted toward new goals, including legal equality and later the Equal Rights Amendment. The organization continued to lobby, to hold meetings, to publish, and to pressure government. Alva remained president of the National Woman's Party until her death. Her role did not shrink after suffrage. If anything, she became more focused on turning the victory into lasting influence. In 1929, Alva purchased a house in Washington, D.C. that became the headquarters of the National Woman's Party. That building would later be preserved and is now known as the Belmont Paul Women's Equality National Monument. It stands near the United States Capitol and Supreme Court, a reminder that the fight for rights took place in the shadow of the institutions that denied them. This is one of the reasons Beacon Towers matters even after its destruction. The castle was part of a network of places, money, and organizing that built the infrastructure of the suffrage movement. It was not the only site, but it was one of the most dramatic. At the same time, Beacon Towers was also part of another world, the world of elite leisure and the Gold Coast. That world was entering the Roaring Twenties, an era of parties, jazz, and public fascination with the rich. And that is where the castle begins to drift toward its most famous ghost. After the 19th Amendment, many Americans assumed that the story of women's political rights was complete. But activists knew better. Voting was a foundation, not a ceiling. The National Woman's Party pressed for broader legal equality. In the years after Alva's death, the organization would support the Equal Rights Amendment and other reforms. The work continued through lobbying, legal strategy, and public campaigns. The headquarters in Washington, D.C. became central. In 1929, the National Woman's Party acquired the Sewall House on Constitution Avenue, and the organization renamed it the Alva Belmont House in her honor. The building served for decades as the center of organizing, archives, and public education. Today, that site is protected as the Belmont Paul Women's Equality National Monument. The National Park Service describes it as the epicenter of the struggle for women's rights, a place where innovative tactics were developed and long campaigns were sustained. This connection returns us to Beacon Towers. Alva did not build one symbol and stop. She used multiple properties, multiple platforms, and multiple strategies to push a political change through a resistant system. Beacon Towers was the most dramatic of her private monuments. The Washington headquarters became the most durable of her public legacies. Between them lies a lesson. Buildings can vanish, but institutions can survive. Victory did not end the story. It only changed the questions. What to do with power once it is won, and what to do with a fortress once the battle moves on. In 1924, Alva expanded the Beacon Towers property by purchasing the adjacent Sands Point Light property, including the old lighthouse. The acquisition tightened her control over the landscape around the castle and connected the estate even more directly to the idea of beacons and signals. This detail matters because it shows that Alva was still thinking in terms of territory. She did not build a castle and then relax. She continued to shape the environment around it, but it also hints at the pressure of wealth. Buying more land is one way to protect privacy, but it also increases the responsibility. More buildings, more upkeep, more staff, more cost. A great estate is never finished. It is always demanding more. Within a year of this expansion, Alva closed Beacon Towers as a residence. In 1925 she left, spending more time in France. The castle remained, but the era of Beacon Towers as Alva's active stronghold was ending. Beacon Towers as a place of organizing. After 1918, Beacon Towers stood completed on its 7 acres, glowing above the water. At first glance, it looked like the ultimate private refuge, but Alva did not treat it as a quiet hideaway. She hosted gatherings connected to the suffrage movement. Retreats, meetings, and discussions could take place away from the surveillance and distractions of Manhattan. The estate provided both privacy and symbolism. A meeting in a rented office could be ignored. A meeting in a castle attracted attention, even if the attention came later through stories and photographs. This was also a period when suffrage strategy was becoming more confrontational. The Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage, led by Alice Paul and Lucy Burns, had separated from the National American Women's Suffrage Association in 1913. The Congressional Union later became the core of the National Woman's Party. Their focus was a federal amendment. Their tactics included public protest and pressure on the president. Alva supported this approach. She served on executive boards, funded activities, and took leadership roles. Her experience with public spectacle and social strategy became part of the movement's toolkit. It is important to recognize the tension in this. Alva was one of the richest women in America, operating in a landscape built on inequality. Yet she was also fighting for a democratic right that would reshape the political system. She was using aristocratic tools to push a democratic change. At Beacon Towers, that contradiction became visible. Women could plan political strategies in rooms decorated with Joan of Arc. They could discuss voting rights while looking out at the water that separated them from the crowded city. They could gather in a space that society could not dismiss as small or ordinary. In other words, Beacon Towers functioned as a fortress not because it could repel an army, but because it could repel the social idea that women belonged only in private life. The castle announced the opposite. It said, women can build, women can organize, women can fight, and women can win. The White House pickets and the Night of Terror. In 1916, Alva was among the founders of the National Woman's Party. In January 1917, the party began the first picketing ever held in front of the White House. Women stood at the gates with banners, day after day, while President Woodrow Wilson entered and left. At first, the protests were treated with curiosity. Then the country entered the First World War, and public tolerance changed. Pickets were arrested. They were charged with obstructing traffic. They were sentenced to jail. Imprisonment became a weapon of the movement. The women did not accept it quietly. They protested inside jail. Some went on hunger strike. Authorities responded with force-feeding and harsh treatment. Public outrage began to grow. On the 14th of November, 1917, suffrage prisoners arriving at the Occoquan Workhouse in Virginia were brutalized. The event became known as the Night of Terror. The details came out through reports smuggled and shared, and the story shocked many Americans who had never considered that women demanding the vote would be treated like criminals. The National Woman's Party understood the power of that outrage. In December 1917, Alva chaired a mass meeting at the Belasco Theater. Thousands attended. Newly released prisoners were honored. The party awarded silver, jailed for freedom pins, shaped like a jail cell door, to recognize women who had served time for the cause. This was a turning point in public perception. The image of women standing at the White House, the image of women being arrested, the image of women refusing food and being punished for it. All of it forced the question into national attention. The political process still took years, but the momentum was undeniable. The federal amendment moved through Congress and then to the states. On the 18th of August 1920, the 19th Amendment was ratified. Women in the United States had won the right to vote. Alva had played a major role in funding and supporting this militant campaign. Her castle on Long Island, built during the height of that struggle, now stood as a monument to the kind of ambition that victory required. But victory did not end history. It only changed its direction. Chapter 3. Across the Bay. Fitzgerald and the Gatsby Shadow. F. Scott Fitzgerald, Long Island, and a novel published in 1925. F. Scott Fitzgerald arrived on Long Island at the start of the 1920s. He and his wife Zelda lived in Great Neck from late 1922 into 1924. Watching the social divide between new money and old money play out across the shoreline communities. Fitzgerald was not writing about castles because he loved architecture. He was writing about desire and illusion. He watched parties that looked like celebrations and felt like performances. He watched men spend money to build identities. He watched women become symbols of status. He watched the way wealth could feel like magic, and the way that magic could turn into emptiness. He drafted The Great Gatsby in 1924. The novel was published on the 10th of April 1925. It is set on Long Island, near New York City, during the Jazz Age. Its central image is the mansion of J. Gatsby, a place of extravagant parties built by a man trying to reach back toward a lost love. Over time, Beacon Towers became often cited as one of the real-life estates that inspired the look of Gatsby's home. Preservation groups and later documentaries have repeated the claim. Some sources treat it as a strong possibility, others as a myth among many myths. The truth is that Fitzgerald drew inspiration from a landscape of wealth. One specific building may have mattered less than the overall atmosphere. Still, the link persists because it fits. Beacon Towers was visible, dramatic, and different from the classical mansions around it. It looked like a fantasy built for attention, exactly the kind of place that would suit a character like Gatsby. Decades later, film design would echo this. When Baz Luhrmann made a new film adaptation of The Great Gatsby, released in 2013, the production design team looked to real Long Island mansions and to the long-destroyed Beacon Towers as part of their research. The goal was to create a house that felt like a dream built by excess, a fantasy pushed into architecture. So, even if Beacon Towers did not directly inspire Fitzgerald at a specific moment, it became part of the cultural vocabulary of Gatsby. The castle became one more proof that the Jazz Age was real, and that its luxury had concrete shapes. But by the time Gatsby became myth, Beacon Towers itself was already on its way to becoming someone else's property. By the mid-1922s, the North Shore had become a theater of money and imagination. Writers watched it, photographers framed it, and the culture began to turn mansions into myths. To understand why Beacon Towers became linked to Gatsby, you need to understand the atmosphere of Long Island in the early 1920s. The Gold Coast was not only a place of wealth, it was a theater. Parties were performances, guests were costumes, music, food, and lighting were arranged to create the impression of endless celebration. At the same time, the region was divided by class in a way that felt almost geographical. Some communities represented old wealth, inherited status, and social rules that went back generations. Others represented new money, people who had made fortunes quickly and were still trying to buy acceptance. This social tension is one of the engines of The Great Gatsby. Fitzgerald watched it closely. He saw how money could create a castle, but could not automatically create belonging. He saw how a person could throw lavish parties and still feel alone. He saw how wealth could turn into a kind of performance that never ended. Beacon Towers fit that mood. It was too dramatic to be ignored. Its silhouette looked like a dream. It was the kind of home that could make people whisper, even if they never entered. Preservation writers later described Beacon Towers as often cited as Fitzgerald's architectural muse. Other writers cautioned that myths abound, and that multiple mansions likely contributed to the novel's imagery. Both views can be true at once. A novel can absorb many inputs, and a single building can still become a symbol. This is how places become ghosts. They are photographed, they are described, they are repeated in conversation. Then, even after demolition, they continue to exist in imagination. Beacon Towers did not need to stand forever to become part of the Jazz Age story. It only needed to stand long enough to be seen. Chapter 4. Hearst and St. John's. Beacon Towers made sense in Hearst's life because Hearst was drawn to castles the way some people are drawn to trophies. By the late 1920s, Hearst was collecting art and architectural pieces at a scale few could match. He treated buildings as stages for that collection, and he preferred structures that looked like power made visible. William Randolph Hearst buys a castle. In the autumn of 1927, William Randolph Hearst bought Beacon Towers. Hearst was one of the most influential media figures in American history. His newspapers shaped public opinion. His business style was aggressive. His name became linked to the rise of modern mass media. Hearst also collected things. He collected art, he collected antiques, he collected buildings and pieces of buildings. His appetite for grandeur was almost unlimited. According to later accounts, Hearst bought Beacon Towers as a home for his wife, Millicent. The idea of a between-seasons home near New York fit the reality of elite life. Summers in one place, winters in another, travel across the country and across oceans. A castle on Long Island Sound could serve as both a retreat and a symbol. Hearst made changes. Records note that while he owned the estate, the roof was raised and dormers were added. Windows were expanded or removed. The entryway was remodeled into a recessed doorway. These changes altered the castle's silhouette and its relationship to light and space. The estate was sometimes known as St. John's during the Hearst period, a name that echoed the Joan of Arc symbolism Alva had embedded. The renaming, whether official or informal, shows how strongly that theme clung to the place. Even a new owner could not erase it completely. Beacon Towers under Hearst became part of a larger pattern. In the late 1920s, American wealth still believed it could last forever. The biggest fortunes acted as if economic gravity did not apply to them. But history was about to prove otherwise. Some of the changes were practical, others symbolic. Later descriptions of the renovation note a raised roof, new dormers, and adjustments to the main entry. Inside, the house was treated like a gallery. Accounts speak of entire historic rooms being installed within the newer structure, with as many as 16 European rooms reconstructed as showcases. At the same time, much of the original Joan of Arc mural work associated with Alva's vision was removed. Even the name St. John's could not fully preserve that earlier meaning. In the early years of Hearst's ownership, the castle was less a private refuge than a symbol. It was often referred to as St. John's, a name that echoed the earlier Joan of Arc theme, even as the purpose of the estate shifted. Interiors were altered to fit Hearst's taste for spectacle and collection. Then came a moment that captured the contradiction of the era. In the summer of 1933, a lavish gathering at St. John's drew roughly 2,000 guests. The guest list reportedly included stars of the stage, prominent public figures, and pillars of high society. Outside the walls, the Great Depression was still crushing wages and jobs. Inside the walls, music carried across the terraces, as if wealth could keep history out. When fortunes shift, the 1930s brought the Great Depression. The economic crisis did not affect every rich person equally, but it changed the environment around wealth. Public anger grew. Governments looked for revenue. Maintaining extravagant estates became more difficult to justify, both financially and socially. Hearst's empire faced pressure. Media businesses depend on advertising and public spending, both of which can shrink during crisis. Large financial commitments become liabilities when conditions change. At the same time, large estates required constant labor. Even if a wealthy owner could pay the bills, the scale of the operation demanded staff, supplies, repairs, and management. A castle on the shoreline might look solid from a distance, but inside it required constant work to remain livable. The pressure was not only cultural, it was structural. Large estates required constant labor, constant repair, and constant cash flow. When the flow slowed, a castle became less a dream than a liability. The story of Beacon Towers would soon turn from renovation to retreat. The details of that retreat and the final disappearance of the castle belong to the next chapter. Chapter 5. The Fall of Beacon Towers and What Remains. By the mid-1930s, the glamour around Hearst's empire was colliding with arithmetic. Advertising revenue fell, credit tightened, and the costs of maintaining far-flung properties stopped looking like a private matter. In 1937, the corporate structure behind Hearst's holdings was reported to be carrying about $126 million in debt. Under court-supervised restructuring, Hearst lost direct control of much of the machine he had built. Accounts from the period describe a humiliating reversal. The man who had acted like the owner of everything was now treated like an employee. His pay was set at about $500,000 a year, while dividends of roughly $700,000 were cut off. To raise cash, the collection began to bleed. In 1938, large auctions started moving art, furniture, silver, tapestries, and carved architectural pieces out of Hearst's world. Some items went to major institutions and preservation projects, others disappeared into private hands. The process continued year after year. In 1941, the scale became undeniable. Reports described tens of thousands of objects being sold, and Citizen Kane appeared in theaters. Many viewers recognized the familiar outline of a media tycoon building a private monument, surrounding himself with trophies, and losing control of the story. In 1942, Beacon Towers changed hands. At the same time, the 1,940 seconds were an era of enormous pressure on resources and labor. World War II required materials, workers, and attention. Many luxuries were restricted. Even wealthy people faced shortages and changing priorities. A castle designed for leisure did not match the national mood. Then the war ended, and the country pivoted toward rebuilding private life. Soldiers returned, families formed, the demand for housing grew. The suburban ideal expanded across Long Island. Land that once held one estate could now hold many homes. For developers and local planners, the logic was straightforward. A huge private castle did not create as much economic value as a neighborhood of houses. A single estate did not align with the new population patterns. Taxes, maintenance, and opportunity all pushed in the same direction. There is another factor that is harder to measure: taste. The early 20th century had admired European imitation. By the mid-century, many Americans preferred modern comfort. A Gothic castle could feel like a costume from an older era. It could seem impractical, even ridiculous, to people who were thinking about garages, refrigerators, and manageable lawns. So, the decision formed: remove the castle and reuse the land. By the time the wrecking crews arrived, the castle was not being defended by a powerful owner who considered it part of his identity. It had become a financial problem on a valuable shoreline. Accounts from the period describe banks trying for years to sell the property as a single estate, only to learn that almost no one wanted a medieval-style castle with enormous operating costs. The buyer who finally made the numbers work did not buy Beacon Towers for its beauty. He bought the land for its lots. Demolition was priced at about $10,000, a sum that feels absurdly small compared with what the estate had represented at its peak. Stone and plaster that once signaled permanence were reduced to rubble with the same blunt efficiency used on warehouses and barns. When the last walls came down, the story closed with a hard fact. From the purchase of the site in 1917 to the demolition in 1945, Beacon Towers had existed for only 27 years. New streets and new houses filled the space, and the coastline returned to being private property without a landmark that could be seen from across the water. When Beacon Towers was demolished in 1945, the action was both specific and symbolic. It was specific because it removed a particular building. It was symbolic because it marked the end of a certain kind of American confidence. The Gilded Age assumption that fortunes could build permanent monuments was proving false. The landscape of wealth was being rearranged by economics and history. It is tempting to imagine that if Beacon Towers had lasted a few more years, it might have been saved as a museum. But preservation movements were not yet as strong as they would become later. Many historic buildings were lost before the public developed the habit of protecting them. In that sense, Beacon Towers was a victim of timing. It was too young to be viewed as ancient, and too old to fit the future. It stood in the narrow gap between admiration and usefulness. And yet, for all the forces pushing toward demolition, the speed of the loss still shocks the imagination. A castle that required intense planning, money, and labor was erased in a moment of market logic. This is why the story continues to feel tragic, not because the rich lost a toy, but because a piece of political and cultural history was reduced to debris. Beacon Towers was tied to the suffrage movement through its creator. It was tied to American myth through Gatsby. It was tied to architecture through the Hunt firm and documented plans. When it fell, it took those layers with it, leaving us to rebuild the meaning from fragments. That work of rebuilding is what storytelling does. It gathers evidence, restores context, and holds a vanished place in the mind long enough for its lessons to land. When the finances tightened and the era changed, a castle on the water was no longer a symbol. It became a problem, and problems are often solved with demolition rather than memory. In the end, the castle met the one force it could not charm: economics and time. In 1945, Beacon Towers was demolished. Think about that date. The Second World War had just ended. Millions of soldiers were returning home. America was entering a period of suburban expansion. Housing was needed, roads were built, land values shifted. In that world, a giant private castle on a 7-acre beachfront parcel could look less like a masterpiece and more like an obstacle. The cost of maintaining it was high. The number of people who wanted to live in such a place was shrinking. The land beneath it could be divided into smaller lots, sold, and developed. So the castle came down. Walls that had been built to look medieval fell to modern demolition. Towers that had been designed to suggest endurance were reduced to rubble. A residential development replaced the estate. Some sources report that multiple houses were built on the site. The exact number depends on how one defines the later development. But the pattern is clear. The land became suburban property. Not everything disappeared. Records note that the original gatehouse survived and that scattered remnants remained. But the main castle, the part that dominated the shoreline, was gone. Less than 3 decades after its completion, Beacon Towers existed only in photographs, drawings, and memory. And yet, it did not truly vanish. Beacon Towers was not alone. Across Long Island and across the United States, many grand estates of the Gilded Age were demolished in the 20th century. The reasons were practical. Large private houses were expensive to maintain. They required staff, repairs, and constant updates. As social patterns changed, fewer wealthy families wanted to run such operations. The rise of modern conveniences did not eliminate cost. It sometimes increased expectations. Land values also changed. A single estate could be divided into many lots. Developers could build multiple houses and sell them separately, turning one property into a larger total profit. In a growing suburban America, that logic became powerful. Public mood mattered too. After the Great Depression and 2 world wars, the celebration of private luxury felt different. Some owners donated estates to institutions. Others sold furnishings and abandoned buildings. Some structures survived by being converted into museums, schools, or public parks. Many did not survive at all. Writers at the National Trust for Historic Preservation have noted that the Gold Coast once held many grand mansions, and that many have been razed or repurposed. In that context, Beacon Towers becomes part of a larger pattern: the vanishing of a landscape that once defined American wealth. The difference is that Beacon Towers carried an extra layer of meaning. It was tied to the suffrage movement, and it was tied to Gatsby mythology. Its disappearance feels like the disappearance of a symbol, not just a building. That is why the story continues. After the demolition, the story does not end, it changes form. When a building like Beacon Towers disappears, it leaves more than an empty lot. It leaves questions. Why build so much if it will not last? The answer is that Beacon Towers was built for a specific moment. It was built in the final years of the suffrage fight, when Alva Belmont wanted a home that could embody the courage she admired. It was built when the Gold Coast still believed that wealth could turn fantasies into reality. It was built when American society accepted that private fortunes could create monuments larger than public buildings. But the moment changed. The movement won the vote and moved into new struggles. The economy shifted. The culture shifted. Land became more valuable as a commodity than as a stage for castles. The world that had made Beacon Towers possible no longer existed in the same way. Still, the story of Alva did not end with demolition. Her political legacy remained visible. The headquarters she purchased in Washington, D.C., became a historic site. It is now preserved as the Belmont Paul Women's Equality National Monument, dedicated to the history of women's rights, activism, and the National Woman's Party. The artistic legacy also remains visible. Documentation of Vincent Adorantes' Joan of Arc murals survives in museum collections. Architectural plans survive in the Library of Congress, preserving the layout and design choices of Hunt and Hunt. And the cultural legacy continues. Beacon Towers became part of the Gatsby myth. Preservation writers and documentaries have pointed to it as a likely inspiration for the fictional mansion of Jay Gatsby. The PBS series American Experience has said Fitzgerald used it as inspiration for Gatsby's home. Film designers have looked to it when recreating the Jazz Age dream on screen. In other words, the castle that was demolished still shapes how America imagines wealth. But perhaps the most important legacy is simpler. Beacon Towers reminds us that architecture can be political. A building can be more than a private indulgence. It can be a message carved into a skyline. Alva Belmont did not build her last great American home to hide from the world. She built it to confront the world, to prove that a woman could claim space, command attention, and fight for rights. The castle fell. The rights remained. If you go to Sands Point today, you will not find Beacon Towers rising over the water. You will find a different landscape, a residential development, private homes, and a shoreline still beautiful, but no longer crowned by a Gothic fantasy. Yet traces remain, depending on where you look and what you know. The original gatehouse survived, a smaller structure that hints at the scale and style of what once stood beyond it. Some reports describe scattered structural remains embedded in the landscape. Photographs preserved in archives show the castle from multiple angles, letting us reconstruct its silhouette in the mind. Architectural drawings preserved in the Library of Congress preserve its planned layout, proving that the castle was designed with professional rigor, not improvisation. In museums and collections, sketches related to the Joan of Arc murals survive. These fragments matter because they anchor the story in physical evidence. When a great house vanishes, the risk is that it turns into pure legend. Beacon Towers is protected from that fate by documentation, plans, photos, records, names, dates. That is why we can tell its story without inventing it. A place can be gone and still be real. The light at the end of the dock. The Great Gatsby ends with an image of reaching, again and again, toward a light across the water. That green light becomes a symbol of desire and illusion. Beacon Towers was another kind of light. Not a small lamp, but a whole building designed to shine. Its white walls caught sun and moon. Its towers stood like signals. Its name even spoke the language of warning and guidance. For a short time, it was real. People walked its rooms. Women planned strategy beneath Joan of Arc murals. Staff kept the house alive. Guests arrived by car and boat. The Gold Coast carried on its glittering performances. Then, the castle was torn down and replaced by ordinary homes. And yet, if you look at photographs of Beacon Towers, the image still feels alive. That is the power of architecture and the power of story. Some places remain present, even after they are gone. If you want more true stories like this, stories where buildings reveal the hidden machinery of history, please subscribe to the channel. And tell me in the comments, do you think Beacon Towers should have been preserved, or was its fate inevitable in the changing America of the 20th century? A note on sources and memory. Stories about lost mansions often attract exaggeration. It is easy to add celebrity guests, secret rooms, or dramatic last parties, because the building cannot contradict the storyteller. For this script, I avoided that temptation. I stayed with what records and reputable histories support. The dates of construction, the names of architects, the documented suffrage activities, the ownership timeline, and the verified preservation trail of drawings and museum materials. If you want to go deeper, look for architectural drawings in national collections, and read the histories of the National Woman's Party and the White House pickets. When you do, you will see the same pattern again and again. The most dramatic parts of this story are not rumors, they are documented. A castle rose, a movement marched, a president was pressured to act, a constitutional amendment was ratified, a media tycoon bought the symbol, then the symbol was demolished and replaced by ordinary lots. What remains is the lesson. History is not only in textbooks, it is in landscapes and buildings, and in the choices a society makes about what it preserves and what it destroys. Thank you for listening.